Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels and welcome to another video. And as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subs and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you all so much, I really appreciate it. And if any of you out there would like to take a couple of extra steps to help support the channel a little bit more, there's a merch store and a Patreon for this channel in the links below. Thank you all so much for all your support. Alright guys, well hey, I know you all have been waiting for this video for a little while, and guess what guys? The day has finally come. So join me in today's video as we finish telling the story of both Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, the two men who were in charge of operating the Titanic's Marconi wireless system. Join me in this video as we finish telling their story, and we also talk about how their actions ultimately helped save the lives of every single person who would end up surviving the Titanic disaster. Alright, well hey, with that announcement out of the way, let's begin today's video. When we last left wireless operator Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, the two men were busy in the Titanic's Marconi Room sending a batch of messages from the RMS Titanic to Cape Race. It was approximately 11:38 p.m. on board the RMS Titanic on the night of April the 14th, 1912. Then, at 11:39 p.m. ship's time, an iceberg was spotted directly ahead of the Titanic. First Officer William Murdoch ordered the Titanic to turn hard to starboard, which, due to tiller commands, means turn the ship to port. He also ordered the Titanic's engines to be stopped, as they tried to get around the iceberg. The Titanic's bow began to turn a little bit, however they did not have enough time to get the Titanic successfully around the iceberg. At 11:40 p.m. ship's time, the Titanic struck the iceberg on the starboard side below the waterline, puncturing several holes into several of the Titanic's watertight compartments. The iceberg impact lasted only roughly 10 seconds, and as a result of the iceberg impact, 6 of the Titanic's 16 watertight compartments was now open to the sea. Now, based on what information that I could find on this subject, it seems like that both Jack Phillips and Harold Bride didn't really notice anything all that severe at the moment that the Titanic struck the iceberg. This is because, due to their location on board the Titanic, the force of the initial impact between the ship and the berg wasn't felt that strongly there. For those of you who don't know, the Marconi Room was located on the boat deck level of the Titanic, right around here in the area of the officer's quarters. So this general area that I'm hovering over with my fingers, this is where the general area of the Marconi Room was. So because the Marconi Room was located so high up on the Titanic, the force of the ship hitting the berg really wouldn't have felt anything more than like a gentle heave of the engines. Or it may have felt like the Titanic just hit a really strong wave to Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. You also have to remember the Marconi Room had no windows in it, so Jack Phillips and Harold Bride had no way to see what was going on outside while they were busy working in the Marconi Room. During the first few minutes following the Titanic's impact with the iceberg, life on board the ship would still seem more or less normal. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride definitely wouldn't have noticed anything at this point since both men were still in the Marconi Room. However, at this exact same time, Captain Smith, the Titanic's designer Thomas Andrews, and the Titanic's chief engineer Joseph Bell were all getting ready to go out and have their own inspections of the ship to see how bad the damage truly was. Now, at the exact same time that Captain Smith, Thomas Andrews, and Joseph Bell were all beginning their inspections of the ship, as far as Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were concerned, life on board the Titanic was still proceeding as normal. What you have to remember is, it's only been roughly 5 minutes or so since the Titanic had struck the iceberg, so no one would have went to the Marconi Room to talk to these two men yet. Now, the first real sign of trouble for both Jack Phillips and Harold Bride would have been just a few minutes later, or would have happened just a few minutes later. This would have occurred at roughly 11:48, maybe 11:50 p.m., somewhere right around there. You see, at that general time frame, the Titanic began to vent out steam through her massive funnels. You see, leading up to the Titanic's iceberg impact, the Titanic had been operating under near maximum steam pressure. And what you need to understand is, unlike ships today that run on gas or fuel or whatever, steamships, well, you can't just switch the engines off and not deal with the steam pressure. Because the way these steamships work is steam is made by the Titanic's massive boilers, and then that steam is sent into the Titanic's massive steam engines, and these steam engines turn the Titanic's propeller and push the ship across the Atlantic. However, when they shut off the Titanic's engines, well, since these steam engines weren't taking that steam anymore, the steam pressure inside the Titanic was continuing to build up, and it would continue to do so until they took care of putting out all of the Titanic's boilers. Now, in order to combat this steam pressure buildup, because if left unchecked, you could have a massive explosion due to all of the steam pressure building up, they had what's called safety valves located inside of the Titanic's funnels. And if the steam pressure inside of a ship got too high, these safety valves would automatically open and this would release the steam pressure. And at roughly 11:48, maybe 11:50 p.m., this is exactly what happened. The Titanic's steam pressure went over the maximum limit that the Titanic could handle, and the ship began to vent out steam. Now, what you have to understand is the process of this ship venting out steam was an extremely loud thing to hear. I mean, it was so loud that those on the Titanic's deck would have to shout at the top of their lungs, cover their hands, and then literally put their hands right beside someone's ear for them to hear it. I mean, it was that loud. And Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, given the location of the Marconi Room on the ship, would have definitely noticed this. Now, there's an incredible clip from the James Cameron movie that does a great job in showing how loud this venting steam was. Now, I'm going to show you that clip in just a second, but I'm giving all of you a heads up right now, especially all of you wearing headphones, that this is going to be very loud. So consider this an audio warning. I'm going to switch to that clip in 3, 2, 1. So yeah, as you can plainly see, the whole process of them venting out all of this steam was definitely a very loud thing that everybody on the Titanic did have to deal with on the night that the ship went down. And another important thing that you have to realize, the whole venting of the ship's excess steam pressure wasn't something that could be done in just 5 minutes. It actually took over an hour for these funnels to stop venting out all of this steam, which means that for roughly the first hour of the sinking, talking to people on the Titanic's deck was extremely difficult. I mean, just imagine how difficult it must have been for all the ship's officers to get all the Titanic's lifeboats ready. And also, fuel for thought, think about how difficult this must have been for Jack Phillips and Harold Bride later in the sinking when they were sending out the Titanic's distress call, because they're sitting there on their radio trying to listen for the faint dots and dashes of Morse code from other ships, all the while having to listen to the massive roaring funnels venting out all the Titanic's excess steam pressure.
Now, Captain Smith would perform several inspections of the Titanic during the first half hour of the sinking. He came back to the bridge from his first inspection at roughly 11:57 p.m. Now, it's important to note that at this time, Captain Smith did not yet know for certain if the Titanic was going to sink. Thomas Andrews and Joseph Bell were still getting ready to head forward to perform their own inspection of the ship at this time. However, even at this early stage in the sinking, Captain Smith had seen enough from his first inspection to know that the situation with the Titanic was very serious. So, even though he did not yet know for certain that the ship was going down, he thought it was appropriate to head back up to the Titanic's bridge and let the bridge crew know that they should begin prepping the Titanic's lifeboats should an evacuation be necessary. It was also at this time that he visited the Marconi Room for the first time and told Jack Phillips and Harold Bride what had happened with the Titanic and the iceberg impact. He told Jack Phillips and Harold Bride at this time to begin prepping to send out a call for help. However, he also told these two men to not send out the call for help until he returned to the Marconi Room to let them know the call for help was necessary.
Once Captain Smith had given the order to Jack Phillips and Harold Bride to begin prepping to send out a call for help, Captain Smith left the Marconi Room and headed back to the Titanic's bridge. Now, once he left the Marconi Room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were obviously stunned to learn what was going on with the Titanic. However, they really didn't have anything to prep in terms of getting the Marconi system ready to send out a call for help like the captain had ordered. You see, the radio was already online, and all they had to do was get on the Morse key and begin sending out a call for help using Morse code. So, because they had really nothing to do, the two men decided to just wait in the Marconi Room for the captain to return to let them know if they needed to send out a call for help.
Once Captain Smith left the Marconi Room, he returned to the Titanic's bridge, at which point he was informed by one of the Titanic's officers that the flooding in the front sections of the Titanic were getting worse. Upon hearing this, Captain Smith went and met up with Thomas Andrews and Joseph Bell, and these two men were getting ready to head forward and perform their own inspection of the Titanic. So Captain Smith decided to join them. Now, it's important to note that Captain Smith was only with these other two men for a very short time, but still, in that short amount of time, Captain Smith saw how badly the ship was flooding. So, Captain Smith returned to the bridge while the other two men were still doing their own inspection of the ship, and Captain Smith gave the order to have all of the Titanic's passengers woken up, and he also gave the order to have all of the Titanic's passengers put their life jackets on. Remember, Captain Smith still did not yet know if the Titanic was going to sink. However, he knew that the flooding was severe enough that he should be prepared, just in case the worst-case scenario should come to pass.
Now, at roughly 12:15 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic, while Captain Smith was on the bridge, Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, met up with Captain Smith on the Titanic's bridge, at which point Thomas Andrews gave Captain Smith the terrible news. He told Captain Smith that the Titanic was going to sink. At this point in time, Captain Smith gave the order to begin loading the Titanic's lifeboats, and he also gave his famous order of women and children first. Now, it was also roughly around this time frame that Captain Smith would have returned to the Marconi Room and told Jack Phillips and Harold Bride to begin sending out a call for help. He told them to let all ships know that the Titanic was sinking and needed assistance as soon as possible. However, it's important to note that at this point in time, Captain Smith was in such a hurry to figure out where the Titanic was and give those coordinates to Jack Phillips and Harold Bride to put into the Titanic's distress call message that he basically got the coordinates wrong. So during the beginning parts of the sinking, as Jack Phillips and Harold Bride began transmitting the Titanic's distress call, they were in fact transmitting the wrong coordinates. So that meant that if any ship was trying to steam towards the Titanic, they were steaming towards the wrong location.
Jack Phillips and Harold Bride sent out the Titanic's very first call for help at roughly 12:27 a.m. The message was very simple. All it said was CQD, 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 MGY, followed by the Titanic's coordinates. Now, the phrase CQD is basically just the international call for help as it stood in 1912. And then the letters MGY, well, that was the Titanic's radio call sign. The first vessel to respond to the Titanic's distress call was a German ship known as the SS Frankfurt. However, due to the fact that the Frankfurt was somewhere between 130 up to 150 miles away from the Titanic, the Frankfurt was too far away to be able to lend any assistance to the Titanic. However, when communicating with the Frankfurt, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride discovered another issue. Since the Frankfurt was a German ship and the wireless operator on the Frankfurt was German, any messages sent to and from the Frankfurt had to be translated into German, which means that anytime Jack Phillips and Harold Bride wanted to communicate with the Frankfurt, they had to translate all of their messages into German.
Now, at the exact same time that Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were sending out the Titanic's first call for help, on the Titanic's bridge, 4th Officer Boxhall had just arrived and learned from Captain Smith how serious of a situation they were all in with the Titanic. Now, during this same conversation between Boxhall and Captain Smith told Boxhall that he had told Jack Phillips and Harold Bride to send out a call for help, and Captain Smith also mentioned that he gave Jack Phillips and Harold Bride a rough location as to where the Titanic was currently at on the Atlantic. Now, when Boxhall heard this, he got very nervous because he was concerned that the Titanic's coordinates that Captain Smith had worked out might be incorrect. So Captain Smith told Boxhall to go and figure out if his coordinates were accurate or if they needed to revise their coordinates. And if the coordinates needed to be updated, he also told Boxhall to give these coordinates to Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. After Boxhall left the bridge, he quickly went to go and try to figure out the Titanic's actual position on the Atlantic and compare that to where the captain said he thought the ship was. Boxhall discovered that his fears were justified. The captain's coordinates were definitely off. He discovered that Captain Smith's coordinates were roughly 20 miles or so off to where the Titanic actually was. So Boxhall quickly worked out the Titanic's new coordinates and then took that to the Marconi Room for Jack Phillips and Harold Bride to put into an updated distress call message. However, it's important to note that Boxhall's coordinates, while they weren't as off as Captain Smith's, his coordinates were off as well. Boxhall's coordinates were roughly 13 miles off to where the Titanic actually was on the Atlantic. Now, it's important to note here that these men weren't being negligent when they were trying to figure out the Titanic's position. What you have to remember is that in 1912, it was a lot more difficult for people on a ship to figure out a ship's actual position. You know, there was a complicated formula they had to use to work all this stuff out, and then they had to use something called dead reckoning to figure it out as well. So just given everything that was going on, the two men made a mistake when they were trying to calculate the Titanic's position on the Atlantic.
Jack Phillips and Harold Bride began transmitting the Titanic's updated distress call message at roughly 12:37 a.m. When they began sending out this message, it was picked up by the Cunard liner Carpathia, who immediately changed course and began heading towards the Titanic's location. However, it's important to note that the Carpathia was somewhere around 50 to 55 miles away from the Titanic when it picked up the distress call. So even though it did start heading towards the Titanic's general location, it would arrive far too late to be able to pick up everybody from the Titanic before the ship would sink.
Now, when Jack Phillips and Harold Bride made contact with the Carpathia, the wireless operator on board the Carpathia was a man by the name of Harold Cotta. And believe it or not, there was this whole ordeal that everybody on the Carpathia had to go through in order to get the ship to head towards the Titanic's location. However, I'm not going to be going into any of that in this video because I've already talked about it in a past video. If you would like to learn about that, I would encourage you to go and watch my video on the RMS Carpathia and the role that it played on the night that the Titanic sank video. I will include a link to that video in the description below.
Once Jack Phillips and Harold Bride realized that the Carpathia was on its way to the Titanic, Jack Phillips, who was on the Morse key at the time, sent Harold Bride onto the bridge to find Captain Smith and let him know that the Carpathia was coming. Harold Bride quickly found the captain and told him about the Carpathia, and he told Captain Smith that the Carpathia would arrive in 4 hours. Once Captain Smith learned this, he turned to Harold Bride and yelled, "4 hours!" And then Captain Smith composed himself, thanked Harold Bride, and sent him back to the Marconi Room to look for any other ships that may be able to help the Titanic.
Now, the reason that Captain Smith yelled at Harold Bride 4 hours when he learned how long it was going to take the Carpathia to reach the Titanic was because a little bit earlier in the sinking, when Captain Smith had met up with Thomas Andrews, Thomas Andrews had told Captain Smith that, as we said earlier, the Titanic was going to sink. But Thomas Andrews also told Captain Smith that he gave the ship maybe an hour up to an hour and a half to live. So when Harold Bride showed up and told Captain Smith, yeah, the Carpathia is coming, it will be here in 4 hours, Captain Smith knew that the Carpathia would not arrive in time to help the Titanic survivors before the ship went down. That's why he yelled out 4 hours when Harold Bride came to tell him that the Carpathia was on its way.
Over the next 60 to 90 minutes, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride would continue to transmit the Titanic's distress signal, and this distress signal would be picked up by ships all across the Atlantic. One such ship to pick up the distress signal was the Titanic's very own sister ship, the Olympic. However, at being more than 400 miles away from the Titanic, it would be impossible for the Olympic to lend the Titanic any assistance. Now, as the night continued to play out, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride noticed something odd going on with the Titanic's radio system. They noticed that their signal was getting weaker and weaker as the ship continued to sink. It was getting more difficult for both Jack Phillips and Harold Bride to hear the signal coming to them from other ships, and it was also getting more difficult for them to send out the distress signal. What was going on was, as the Titanic was continuing to sink and the ship's power was getting weaker, it was getting more difficult for the Marconi wireless system to send out the Titanic's distress signal.
Now, in case you're wondering why the signal from the Titanic's Marconi wireless system was getting weaker and weaker as the sinking of the Titanic was continuing to play out, was because even though the Titanic still had power throughout most of the sinking, and the radio system was still getting that power, the Titanic's power was getting weaker as the Titanic was continuing to sink. And the amount of power that you can feed into one of these Marconi wireless systems directly affected the range that the radio could both pick up and send out signals. So that means that as the Titanic was continuing to sink and the ship's power was getting weaker and weaker, the signal at which the Titanic could send out and receive messages was getting weaker and weaker as the sinking of the Titanic was continuing to play out. It was literally just like this. 1 minute, you've got a ship that's 400 miles away, let's say the Olympic, for example. Well, 1 minute, the Olympic can both hear and talk to the Titanic. However, a minute later, the Olympic can't hear the Titanic any longer. However, the Carpathia, which is closer to the Titanic at being somewhere around 50 to 55 miles away, can still pick up the Titanic's distress signal. So this is how these Marconi wireless systems worked, and this is why the signal from the radio was getting weaker and weaker as the sinking of the Titanic was continuing to play out.
Now, it's important to note that for most of the evening, Jack Phillips was the one who was sending out the Titanic's distress signal. Even though both he and Harold Bride were in the Marconi Room at the same time, Harold Bride was usually just there, and Jack Phillips would occasionally send him out onto the boat deck to see what was going on. Now, at 1:52 a.m., the two men traded seats, and Harold Bride took over control of the radio, and Jack Phillips walked out onto the boat deck to see what was going on with the Titanic. He noticed that the forward well deck was awash, and he also noticed the strong list to port. He returned to the Marconi Room and told Harold Brad what he saw, at which point the two men traded seats once again, and Jack Phillips continued to try to send out the Titanic's distress signal.
Now, throughout the course of the entire evening, Harold Brad began to notice something odd in the behavior of his friend Jack Phillips. He noticed that slowly but surely, Jack Phillips was beginning to have small mental breakdowns as the sinking of the Titanic was continuing to play out. And these mental breakdowns would only get worse as the ship continued to sink. You see, what was going on was, and I'm sure the fact that Jack Phillips didn't have enough sleep was a factor to this, but it's commonly believed that Jack Phillips felt like it was up to him to save everyone on the Titanic before it sank. And if he didn't get another ship to the Titanic, then it would be his fault that everybody on the ship would die. And because he was thinking this, he was becoming oblivious to everything else, you know? So it got to the point during the final stages of the sinking that Harold Brad was starting to scream at Jack. He's like, "Jack, we've got to go. The ship is sinking. The water is one deck below us. I'm sure you're not even transmitting a signal anymore. What are you doing?" And Jack Phillips just stared straight ahead at the wall, not giving Harold Brad any attention, continuing to hit the Titanic's Morse key, trying to send out a call for help. I mean, Harold Brad was in a full state of panic because he knew how dire their situation was. And if he knew he couldn't convince Jack to leave, then the two men would eventually die as the Marconi Room went underwater as the Titanic continued to sink.
Then, just as Harold Brad was beginning to lose hope that he would ever convince Jack Phillips to leave the Titanic's Marconi Room, at 1:57 a.m., he got some help. At 1:57 a.m., Captain Smith walked into the Marconi Room and told the two men that they had done their full duty, they could do no more, and it was time for them to abandon their cabin. Captain Smith also told them that it was every man for himself at this kind of time. After he said this, Captain Smith walked out of the Marconi Room and left the two men alone in there. Harold Brad then turned to Jack Phillips, and thinking at this point that Jack Phillips would finally be ready to leave the Marconi Room, he's like, "Are you ready to go?" However, Jack Phillips just took one brief look at Harold Brad, then turned right around and began transmitting the Titanic's distress signal once again.
Now, if you thought Harold Brad was agitated at Jack Phillips before Captain Smith walked in, well, after the captain released the two men and Jack Phillips continued to try to send out the Titanic's distress signal, well, I can't describe how annoyed Harold Brad was with Jack Phillips at this point. Harold Brad began to scream at Jack, "Didn't you hear the captain? There's no use in trying to send out a signal anymore. The power's gone. The water's coming. We've got to go." However, once again, Jack Phillips ignored him and continued to try to transmit the Titanic's distress signal. Now, after calming down briefly, Harold Brad decided to give Jack Phillips a few more minutes on the Morse key while he gathered up their personal belongings. While Harold Brad had his back turned, a man, one of the Titanic's crew members, snuck into the Marconi Room. Now, I gotta paint the picture for you a little bit here. While Jack Phillips was working at the Morse key, sitting at the desk, Jack Phillips had his life jacket on. And when this member of the Titanic's crew snuck into the Marconi Room, he began to try to take or steal Jack Phillips' life jacket off from him. And because Jack Phillips was in I guess the right word would be like a state of trance and having all these mental breakdowns, he didn't notice that this guy was literally trying to steal the life jacket off of him. Now, once Harold Brad turned around and he saw this man trying to steal Jack Phillips' life jacket, Harold Brad became enraged and tackled the man. A huge fight broke out in the Marconi Room, which ended when Harold Brad grabbed some kind of an object and he whacked the crew member right in the face and knocked him to the floor. Now, after this had happened, this finally snapped Jack Phillips out of it a little bit, and this is when the two men finally left the Marconi Room together.
Now, Jack Phillips and Harold Brad left the Marconi Room at some time between 2:07, maybe 2:10 a.m., right around there. Harold Brad later testified that when they left the Marconi Room, they could hear water beginning to flood the Titanic's bridge. Now, given the location of the Marconi Room and where it sat on the Titanic, for Harold Brad to be able to say that he could hear water coming, the Titanic was very low in the water. Take a look at this animation right here. This animation shows the location of the Marconi Room. Then all you gotta do is head down this hallway, and then it comes out right on the Titanic's bridge. So, as you can see from this animation, you can clearly see where the water is. So for Harold Brad to say he could hear water coming, this shows how close the two men came to being trapped inside of the Titanic as the ship sank out from under them.
After Jack Phillips and Harold Bride left the Marconi Room, shortly after that, the two men ended up getting separated. Jack Phillips was last seen heading towards the Titanic's stern, while Harold Bride decided to head more towards the Titanic's bridge area to see if he could help out in getting one of the last two lifeboats off of the Titanic. You see, at this late stage in the sinking, there were only two lifeboats left on board the Titanic. You've got Collapsible A on the Titanic's starboard side on the roof of the officers' quarters, and on the Titanic's port side, you've got Collapsible B on the roof of the officers' quarters. Now, since the two men came out of the Marconi Room on the Titanic's port side, Harold Bride headed up to the roof of the officers' quarters and tried to assist Second Officer Charles Lightoller in getting Collapsible B off of the roof of the officers' quarters. He thought if he could do this, then maybe he could get onto Collapsible B and survive the sinking of the Titanic.
Now, as Harold Bride and Second Officer Charles Lightoller, along with several other men, were trying to free Collapsible B and get it down to the roof of the officers' quarters, all of these men pushed the boat off of the roof and it tumbled down to the boat deck. However, due to the Titanic's very sharp list to port, when this lifeboat fell from the roof of the officers' quarters, it landed upside down on the Titanic's boat deck. And to make matters worse, the lifeboat caught Harold Bride and took him down with it. Harold Bride ended up becoming trapped underneath Collapsible Lifeboat B on the Titanic's boat deck as water slowly but surely began to flood underneath the lifeboat.
Boy, I tell you, poor Harold Bride. I mean, think about everything this poor man had to go through on the night that the Titanic went down. I mean, not only did he have to deal with the fact that his ship was sinking, but he also had to deal with Jack Phillips slowly losing his mind throughout the evening. He had to deal with that guy that attacked Jack Phillips at the Marconi Room. And then to top it all off, when he tries to escape the Titanic, he ends up getting trapped underneath a lifeboat that gets flipped upside down. I mean, poor Harold Bride, that's all I gotta say. Anyway, luckily, after Harold Bride got trapped underneath this lifeboat, he wasn't stuck there for very long. Due to the fact that that part of the Titanic was rapidly going underwater, it didn't take long for this lifeboat to float off of him. Once this happened, Harold Bride simply held his breath, went underneath the lifeboat, and came up and then climbed on top of the overturned lifeboat. After he did this, it wasn't long before this lifeboat was pushed away from the rapidly sinking Titanic. Then, Harold Bride, along with Second Officer Charles Lightoller and all the men who were able to climb on top of Collapsible Lifeboat B, drifted away as they watched the Titanic slowly sink right in front of them. Now, the Titanic foundered at 2:20 a.m., and a short time after the Titanic went down, Second Officer Charles Lightoller turned to Harold Bride and asked him if he knew of any ships that were coming to rescue the Titanic survivors. Lightoller, just like Harold Bride, had also escaped the ship on the upside-down lifeboat Collapsible B. Harold Bride turned to Lightoller and said yes, he knew the Carpathia was coming and that it should arrive at somewhere around 4 a.m. And luckily, Harold Bride was exactly right. Right around the time the Carpathia said it would arrive, it steamed into the area at which the Titanic went down and began launching flares to let the Titanic survivors know that rescue would soon be there. Now, ultimately, Harold Bride would end up surviving the sinking of the RMS Titanic. Unfortunately, his friend Jack Phillips would not survive the evening. Now, we don't know for certain what happened to Jack Phillips after him and Harold Bride got separated. There are some conflicting reports that say Jack Phillips made it to Collapsible Lifeboat B. However, Harold Bride later said that he never saw Jack Phillips on that lifeboat. So ultimately, what happened to Jack Phillips, we really don't know. The only thing we know for certain is that he did not survive the sinking of the Titanic. All right, everybody, well, hey, now all of you know the incredible story of Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. And now all of you know how these two men helped save the lives of everybody who was able to escape the Titanic on the night she went down. Now, before I say goodbye to all of you, I do have a few shout outs that I need to give. First of all, I'd like to thank Tom Linsky and his team over at the Part-Time Explorer YouTube channel for letting me use his sinking animation along with his documentary film, The Last Signals, in this video. If you would like to watch those videos, I will include a link to them in the description below. I highly encourage you all to go and watch The Last Signals documentary. It's an incredible documentary that tells the story of Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, so go check that out. I would also like to thank Olivier for sending me this incredible 3D printed model replica of one of the Titanic's reciprocating engines. Now, he isn't selling these 3D printed models, but he is selling the plans for them, so you can 3D print this model yourself if you have a 3D printer. There will be a link for that in the description below. Olivier, thanks for sending this to me. And I would also like to thank the team that's developing a mod for the game Roblox. This mod is its own game called SOS Titanic, and the purpose of this game is to try to escape the Titanic before the ship goes down. I managed to meet one of the guys who was developing this game, and he was kind enough to make that animation you saw in this video that starts off in the Titanic's Marconi Room, goes down the long hallway, and then comes out on the Titanic's bridge. The creator of that game was kind enough to send that to me, so I thought I would do him the same kindness and give a big shout out to him and his team. Guys, thank you so much for sending me that clip. It was a huge help for this video. And all of you out there, please be sure to go and check out the game SOS Titanic, a mod for the game Roblox. Alright everybody, well hey, that's it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure you leave it a like, be sure to subscribe, and thank you all so much for all the support. I could not do this without the support of each and every single one of you. Alright everybody, well hey, you all take care, and I will see you in the next one. Have a good night everybody.
Special thanks to our Captain level Patreon supporters, Jeremy Hack, Jeffrey Clayton, Dakota Charbonneau, Moosh, and Greg Gallick. Thank you all so much for all the support.